Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this is the parallel session on policy, regulation and people, as it says on the slide. So I'm really pleased to see how many people have picked this session. I think can you hear me all right? You're frowning? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll get closer. So I think in the plenary sessions that we've heard this afternoon already, the theme of people and places and policy has come through in all of the talks we've had, and how important that is for the success of CCS and making it sustainable and making it happen. So I'm really pleased to see that the recognition of the importance of this session is reflected by the bums on seats in here. And we've got some illustrious speakers this afternoon as well. We're going to start with Karen Turner from the University of Strathclyde. So she's the director of the Centre for Energy Policy, make sure I've got that right, and will be very familiar to a lot of you here. She's done a lot of work on just transitions and skills within this sector and within industrial decarbonisation generally. So I'll welcome Karen to take the floor. Let's make sure the slides come up.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And again, it's good to see so many people here when we're right at the end of the day. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a paper in our last UKCCSRC project. We had this paper which has got really just such a wonderful title that will probably take you a minute or two to absorb. So just to cut to the chase, we look at what are the economy-wide implications of deploying CCUS here, with a particular focus on the transport and storage side, which as an economist, I see that as a nascent industry in the economy that could help transition oil and gas. And really what we were looking at here is we do a lot of focus on the labour market, not just for the obvious reason of what skills we need, but the labour market is one of the biggest constraints in the UK economy. So if we have shortages of workers and skills, it can push up the cost of projects, but it can also push up the kind of economic system costs. So it's a real challenge having constraints in the labour market, not just for CCUS, but I think across the wider net zero space, where of course we've got an awful lot of things competing for resource. And sorry, I should have mentioned that this work was with a number of co-authors. You can see all of their names. And I think Christian and Julia are both in the room this afternoon, and so they will help take the questions should there be any. So our project, this is a project that ran 2022 to 2023, but we finished that paper. I think we published it early in 24 once we kind of fully went through the work. And there we were asking the question of how might current and persisting UK labour supply constraints impact the economy-wide outcomes of deploying, as I said, a nascent CO2 transport and storage industry. And these are a couple of images that we had from a policy brief. And basically, we sat talking to colleagues at DESNZ where, there's that 50,000 jobs kind of estimate that seems to, I think it's been around since 2019, but maybe because it's a round number, keeps on getting cited. And in the little kind of addition at the bottom, we were saying there's a number of things that would maybe be included in that in terms of CO2 transport and storage industry serving overseas markets, and we did look at a bit of that, but also how the supply chain actors and CCUS generally and TNS in particularly could be exporting services and technology. We focused here on the CO2 transport and storage industry servicing UK industry capture demand, so through the Track 1 and Track 2 clusters. And I guess the headline is the little diagram on the side, is that basically, if we can get policy action on upskilling labour market, upskilling people and on labour market participation as well, you can see the difference. You could go from 5,000 to almost 18,000 jobs. So that's really kind of the size of the prize if we can, here going to the extreme, that we resolve all of our labour supply constraints. And similarly, the gross value added, or GDP per annum, that could kind of, in the scale of double or so, if we can unlock these. So basically, what's underlying this is these are net impacts, is that if we've got labour supply constraints in the economy, we bring something new in, even something that's relatively small scale in the net zero picture. When we start to get competition for jobs, we're starting to push up costs. You would start to get displacement of activity across some other sectors. So the kind of size of the prize could be much bigger, and we're more likely to be able to achieve that where there is action on upskilling and labour market participation. And we've labelled it here as policy action, really with the policy having to act to help unlock some of the barriers to upskilling and increasing participation. And the results, I mean, I'm going to focus on some of the results that we got in that paper for UKCCSRC, but just to say that we keep on running these scenario simulations because the information keeps getting better. You know, we conducted a lot of this research when there's a lot of kind of commercial sensitivity about some of the information. We were having to make assumptions because we didn't have better, including things like how many emitters might be using different elements of the system. So we keep rerunning these scenarios, and I'll say a bit at the end because we've got a new project now to do another rerun now that track 1 is starting to kind of firm up. We don't know yet what's going to happen with track 2, but generally we'll update the work. But basically everything that we found in our UKCCSRC project, the results were reinforced. We were part of the Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure Programme, which was around the Acorn cluster. But there we also did look at the other 3 clusters as well. So basically our kind of qualitative findings were reinforced. There we did have a focus on Acorn, but as I said, we ran the simulations for all the track 1 and 2. And I think the key findings, the kind of qualitative findings are first, that introducing CO2 transport and storage in the economy can deliver sustainable economic gains. And this could happen quite quickly, you know, within a 10 to 15 year time period. I mean, that's our kind of full adjustment of the economy. We also found there, we didn't look at it in this UKCCSRC work, but if we could extend capacities to support an export base and transport and storage services, which I know a lot of people call that importing CO2, but as an economist, I think about developing an export base. But doing that could further boost net gains for a variety of reasons. I won't go into it now because of the time shortage. But I've highlighted action and skills and worker shortages is absolutely crucial if we're going to maximise the positive impacts on the economy and on the public purse, which of course is self-reinforcing, you know, where there is support needed for new activities like this. But also in minimising disruptive and distortive congestion effects on both project costs and economic trajectories. And this is, you know, what I was just saying is that if we do start to get wage cost, you know, kind of wage pressure in the system because we've got these labour supply constraints, that's where you start to displace activity in other sectors of the economy. And the last 2 findings, I mean, they're a little bit more Scottish specific, but I think basically the idea of having high marginal transport and storage costs doesn't mean to say that your value case is weak, because basically, like in the case of Scotland, you've got a lot more economic activity involved in delivering transport and storage, partly because of the geographical dispersity of emissions, which means that can help you get a value case. So it's really important that we look at value as well as costs. And we also, some of the stuff that we're still working on is, you know, for example, you know, we're assuming that the supply chain for CO2 transport and storage is a lot like oil and gas, and we oil and gas extraction. We consulted stakeholders on that and kind of got broad agreement. We made some variations. But one of the main things is we need to understand the capital intensity of the sector right. If we don't do that, we could be over or underestimating economy-wide impacts quite considerably. So this paper that gives us the title for the, will help to form the title for this presentation. Basically, we were asking the question there of how important is real wage bargaining in the UK labour market. So yes, we've got a constraint. What happens because we've got a constraint? So you start to get bargaining up of wage rates. And we were looking at this on both the employer and the worker side, kind of on the basis that at times when unemployment is low, like it is at the moment, then there's more bargaining power on the worker side to start bidding up wages. And real wage increases are good for workers and good for households, but they then translate to nominal wage increases or nominal increases in nominal labour costs for firms, and not just in T&S, across the economy. So that's what we were focusing on here, was we want to see just how important is real wage bargaining in governing the economy-wide outcomes. I'm not going to give you a lesson in the economy-wide modelling approach because it's got a fabulous name. Our model's UK Envy, that's easy enough, but it's a multi-sectoral, dynamic, economy-wide, computable general equilibrium framework. Call it CG for short if you need to refer to it at all. But basically, it's a scenario simulation framework to look at economy-wide impacts. We're looking at CO2 transport and storage as a new sector that comes into the economy. As a benchmark, we assume that it shares supply chain characteristics with the existing UK oil and gas industry. We've put some links in here to the papers that go into informing that. And in this work, we're assuming it was initially oversized, really because you've got non-divisible infrastructure and things like that. But this then introduces a challenge of how do you guarantee demand in order to induce investment? And so we were assuming a role for government there, which seems to tie in with what the policy approach has been so far. Of course, we need to understand the size of the sector and the investment that's required, and we do this through techno-economic modelling that we then feed into the economy-wide models. And this is Julie and Christian really led this part of the work, and I've included one of the papers that they've had published. Well, we've had published in that area, but they were the leads on it. So we focus on the labour market. So we're assuming that there is real wage bargaining in the UK labour market, where wage bargaining power on the worker side is inversely related to the unemployment rate. And so what we did was we ran our economy-wide scenario simulations under different scenarios. First of all, we had a central case where we have this kind of unemployment wage elasticity that's been estimated for the UK and seems to be quite stable. We then looked at a case with a higher elasticity, which would really reflect a case where you had very, very limited action on workers and skill shortages. So you're putting more bargaining power on the supply side of the labour market. We then looked at a lower elasticity, really because that's what we're trying to go after. So you get a step up in non-wage action and on non-wage action on worker and skill shortages. We then kind of, for framing, looked at a case where you have a fixed real wage, so there's no wage response at all. But basically, that's like, you get, it's more like an input-output multiplier model. Labour supply will just respond to demand. So that's as if you've resolved all worker and skill shortages. So I guess that's more of a kind of framing outside case. But what we really focused on here, I've highlighted the one number 3, where we're looking at where you have stepped up non-wage action on worker and skill shortages. And then we built on that to say, well, what if you had in-migration to the UK economy? First of all, looking at a transitory in-migration of workers where there's really peak wage pressure, and that might be when construction is going on. And then another one where we looked at a full dynamic adjustment of the labour supply. So rather than just assuming there's no wage response, we were having people come in to the country and expand the labour supply in response to what was happening with wages. And so basically the findings we've got here, we've got different colour lines. Our central case is this yellow one. So basically you've got the nominal wages, the increase in the nominal wage. You can see it goes up in all cases, but it goes up most in the red case, which is where we had that very, very high wage elasticity. So there's no action on worker and skills. You push up nominal wages and then the dotted line follows. That's the consumer price index. So all households in the economy, and also reflecting wider prices. Our central case, as I said, that's the yellow line, and then we're looking at how can we get down below that. And basically, if we go down to that scenario 4, which is where we kind of fully resolve all the supply constraints through with the migration process, you're starting to pull that nominal wage down. So that over the long term, you don't actually get any lasting impacts on the economy at all in terms of prices, and that's where you're going to maximise the economy-wide gains. So this is where we see the economy-wide gains. We're focusing here on UK GDP and total employment. And so basically, the more cost price pressure that's introduced to the economic system, the more limited will be your GDP growth. But I think what's really interesting to look at here is that if you look at our scenario 4, which is basically where we had this, you get the labour supply constraints fully resolve, you're looking at, I know it's only 0.1% in GDP, but if you look at the growth rates that we've got in the economy at the moment, that's pretty good. But you'll see that it's almost about double what we have in the scenario 2, where you've got really no action in labour and skills, and the labour market just gets tighter. And a difference of between kind of like 0.09, it's about 0.03 percentage points of GDP difference of if you take our kind of central case to one where you get full action on workers and skills. And as I said, that might not sound very much, but if you look at growth rates in the UK economy at the moment, that could be a really important contribution. So in short, wage bargaining and what happens to nominal wages in the system has a really quite large effect on what happens with GDP. And then you can see that in the dashed lines, employment is kind of following, it sits lower in terms of percentage changes because this is quite a capital intensive activity, but you're basically getting the same picture again. In terms of your net jobs gains, they're going to be higher the less wage pressure you've got in the economy. And then I think even where you've got net jobs displacement, and that's what we were looking at here, we were looking at for the different scenarios, where do you get some displacement of jobs? And you'll see that there's some, kind of particularly along at well, my right-hand side, maybe your left when you're looking at this, is that scenario 2 where we've got really, really tight conditions, you get the most displacement. But what's interesting here is you don't actually get an awful lot of displacement, and this is because really CO2 transport and storage coming into the economy is not that disruptive It's quite relatively small scale compared to other net zero activities. But if you think back to that previous slide, it still is a more muted expansion. And it's because if you start to get price pressure in the economy that feeds through to consumer price indexes, then you get less, you might have more jobs, but there's less spending power in the economy and things like that. So even with limited displacement of jobs, you could still have a much more muted expansion if you don't resolve these labour supply constraints. Then we went on, these are the two scenarios where we actually had migration. And so basically what we're looking at here is that transitory or permanent alleviation of the absolute labour supply constraint moves things up further again. And what happens is that you look at our employment and our real wage here for scenario 4, which was the kind of simple one, like an input-output multiplier. You'll see that that starts to get tracked in the scenario 6, which is basically where we have more people come in, but at least we've got an explanation for it. We're not making a simplifying assumption. We're saying you're bringing in more people to expand the labour supply. So where we would be in practice, I mean, obviously, migration is a challenging issue in the UK. It might be more likely that you would have a situation like the scenario 5, which is the kind of dark blue line here, which is where you have some transitory in migration to meet particular requirements, you know, for example, in construction activity and things like that. But basically anything, again, it's anything that you can do to resolve this labour supply constraint, you know, whether it's non-wage action on worker and skills and encouraging more participation in the labour market in the UK economy or bringing more people in, that's going to help maximise the economic outcomes. And there are quite substantial differences in terms of GDP and employment. Where you can mitigate this kind of cost price pressure that, as I said, doesn't just apply to the TNS projects, it spreads out throughout the whole economy. Our next steps in our work, I mean, the central case results that we had, that I presented there, we updated them when we did our SNZI report in February 24. And I've shown just some, these are, in this little diagram, these are results just for the Scottish case. But the reason I put it on is we did start to add on there the additional activity that's associated with developing an export base. So where we have shipping in of emissions, so an export base for transport and storage, and increasing that additional capacity and resolving the labour supply constraint there. And the bottom right-hand corner of that diagram, you see that's the kind of size of the prize, and that's just for the Scottish cluster. So basically, action and skills going along the way and having more activity. And I think a key thing is that when you have an export base, it means that, you know, whatever type of model, if it's a commercial model or whatever, you're not drawing in the public purse. So you can basically start to deliver more gains that don't require public support. So basically, we've got a new project. It's an impact accelerator project. So we're going to rerun our scenario simulations as information gets better. And we're going to do this extension to look at the shipping cases and also looking across all 4 clusters as we did in the UKCCSRC work. So we're keeping both of those focuses that we got out of our SNZI and UKCCSRC work. We're working with Starega, the Scottish Government, Nick Young's here today, who's our partner on it, and also Offshore Energies UK. So what we're doing over the period between now and September is we're going to reset and rerun all our scenario simulations, really to update the quantitative results. We would expect the qualitative insights that we've got so far would probably remain pretty much unchanged. But I really wanted to close with this because we're going to be talking to people in industry and to people in government about the scenario simulations, but the more information we can get, so we're keen to engage with people, which obviously this is the main research community in CCS, so we would be keen to talk to you going forward. So if you would like to get in touch, there's my email there and then the team's email at Strathclyde. And as I said, hopefully the qualitative results that I've showed you here today will be unchanged, but we're going to get much better numbers so that hopefully we can inform the policy debate. So thank you very much. Questions?
We'll do it all at the end, yeah. So we'll save questions for Karen to the panel at the end. I think, thanks, Karen. It was really useful to have that level of detail on skills. We keep hearing it mentioned obliquely in a lot of talks, so it's nice to get into a bit more detail. So next up, we have Patrick Devine-Wright from the University of Exeter, who has literally gone the extra mile, I think, to be with us today, having come in on the train this morning. Yeah, so Patrick's a very well-known figure in the field of social science around low carbon energy technologies. So really great to have his perspective today. And I think talking about some of the work through the IDRIC programme as well. So over to you, Patrick.
What button do I press?
It's that one. It's the unmarked one.
The unmarked one, okay. Okay, thank you very much. Great to see so many people in the room, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. As Claire said, I'm based at the University of Exeter, and I'm going to be sharing some information and findings from a couple of projects that I was involved in up until recently as part of a research initiative called IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Forum. And there's a couple of co-authors there that I want to acknowledge as well, and there are others too that I will reference during this talk. So just a summary of what I'm going to be talking about over the next 15 or 20 minutes. I'm going to begin with a shameless plug of a different project, which I'm not going to be going into today, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what it's about. It's called Access, and I'll tell you about it in a second. Then I'm going to be sharing very brief findings from two, as I said, projects that came under the IDRIC stable. One is about place, and the second one is about just transitions from including place and issues around social license, and make some conclusions and recommendations. As you can see from the figures on the slide, there are three clusters in particular that are the focus of this work in Scotland, the Northwest, and in South Wales. And the second of those projects to do with just transition was a multi-university consortium, including Leeds and Manchester and Sussex, as well as us colleagues in Exeter. So I just want to start very briefly by referencing this initiative, which I've been the director of for a couple of years. And if you haven't heard of it, then it is about increasing the visibility of social science understandings and contributions to understanding a range of different environmental problems, including net zero. And it's about making a bit more of what we already know. There's an awful lot of new research going on, but we have decades of understanding of things to do with justice, environmental justice, or to do with social acceptance, or community engagement, or public participation. These have been the subject of social science research for a very long time. We don't always remember stuff that we knew back in the 80s or the 90s or more recently. So one of the things that we try and do in Access is to synthesize and integrate those knowledges and make them more easily accessible. So for example, we finished a task force on net zero last year, and you can see the link on the slide and have a look at it later if you want to. And we also have a database of social science experts. If you are from outside the social sciences and you're wondering who you might wish to speak to that might have a particular methodological skill or disciplinary skill, this is designed to make it easier for you to reach those people. Okay, so enough on Access, but feel free to ask me questions afterwards. So on to the more subject relevant material for this conference. And as I said, there were two projects I was involved in IDRIC that are relevant to carbon capture and hydrogen, of course, as well. And the first one was about place, which has been something that I've been researching for a very long time. I began looking at issues around place about 20 years ago in order to try and better understand so-called NIMBY conflicts over the siting of, say, onshore wind farms across England and across the UK. And so one of the questions that industrial decarbonisation brings to mind is, how does this impact upon places in the real world and the communities that live there? And to what extent are ideas about place important in shaping our understanding of industrial clusters and the technologies of decarbonisation that will be taking place there, not least carbon capture, utilisation and storage? And in this particular project, there were three social science concepts that we drew on: sense of place, which refers to the kind of feelings and emotions and meanings that we associate with places, as well as their material contexts; spatial imaginaries, which is a human geography idea to describe ways or shorthand ways of thinking about space, about particular types of places in the world, or types of spaces, or ways we change those places through development, industrialization, gentrification, etc. So there's lots of literature on these, as well as just transition, which I think many people would at least have heard of at this stage. It remains a fairly ambiguous and contested concept, and we can come back to that. So as part of this project, we did empirical work in three different clusters. as you can see on the right-hand side, as I've mentioned, the Northwest, Scotland and South Wales. And in each of these places, we did two separate things. The first phase looked at stakeholders, the kinds of people who, I guess, are of primary interest to this event. People in government and people in industry who are shaping the trajectories of clusters, who might be instigating and initiating initiatives, and who might be involved in practical projects on the ground. But we are also interested in tapping into the host communities in these clusters as well. So we had to make choices, and we decided to choose one industrial port town in each of the three clusters, and that was Grangemouth in Scotland, Ellesmere Port in the northwest of England, and Milford Haven in the South Wales cluster. Obviously, that represents certain kinds of choices, so we can only speak to those places per se, but we thought that they were interesting taken together and separately in terms of places in those clusters. And we did a qualitative methodology, which involved semi-structured interviews with stakeholders, documentary analysis, field trips, and focus groups with residents of those places and local stakeholders in each of the towns. So this is a qualitative data set. You're not going to see as many numbers as you've done in previous presentations. Hope that's okay. So what I'm going to share with you over the next few slides are quoted materials and interpretation from that qualitative data analysis. And the first thing here is just to give you a little bit of an idea of the sense of place described by the stakeholders that we spoke to. And here we see an idea of place emerging, a sense of place emerging around clusters, very much at the regional level, but related to what's happening internationally and occasionally down at the local level. So for example, the Scottish cluster is definitely depicted as a world-leading initiative, so it's clearly got an international context. And in this sense, you've got an industrial cluster that's framed around the entire nation itself. That's very different from the Northwest, which is a much more ambiguous territory because it slips into North Wales as well. But it's also very much cast in terms of a historical process of the cradle of the Industrial Revolution and then looking forward to the innovation that will drive this decarbonisation programme in that region. And finally, in South Wales, you've got a different kind of architecture which is connecting up smaller clusters in Newport and Cardiff, and where necessary, referring to notable locations like Milford Haven in relation to that wider UK perspective of the UK's largest energy port. And what we had a lot of emphasis in policy was this idea of a super place, which has declined a little bit since then, but in the Boris Johnson era was very much kind of linked to a kind of a boosterist perspective on the amazing potential in change that would take place through industrial decarbonisation. What you didn't tend to see from those policy documents or speeches was any kind of sense of a transparent emphasis on the potential negative impacts of those changes. And of course, what we'll find when I share with you perspectives from host communities was that if they're only presented with the positive upside, the jobs, the skills, the investment, then they're immediately skeptical because they're always wondering, well, what's being concealed then from this overwhelmingly positive narrative, which they don't trust. So decarbonising projects are seen in all of their positive attractions as places for industry to thrive and regaining a sense of autonomy and pride. So as I said, these clusters are seen in the background of decline, in the background of attempts to rejuvenate settlements and clusters more generally, and to develop pride in place and pride in clusters through technology deployment. There's this assumption that technology will lead to overwhelming increases in pride in place, but not a great deal of hard evidence or clarity on how that might take place. So it's almost a revival project. It's a reindustrialization through decarbonisation, which will lead to pride of place and economic success. And we asked stakeholders, let's look forward to 2050. What does a net zero industrial place look like? And we just asked them to describe it to us. We were interested in the way they envisaged the future of those places. And overwhelmingly, what they told us was a vision of technology. It was very difficult to see much else in these descriptions, but technology-centered descriptions. And you can see that in the quote on the right. There's an emphasis upon carbon, capture, energy sources, energy mixes, energy technologies, etc. You can see that from there. What you're not seeing a great deal of emphasis on is other aspects of place, on communities, on culture, on meanings, on feelings, on identities, the variety of things which make up the life of a community in a place. And in fact, we only had one informant in our interviews who considered a slightly broader context of trust building and prosperity in maybe a broader sense of what it's like to live in these places and what the benefits of decarbonisation might look like. Generally found that there was very limited emphasis upon engagement with the clusters, with publics, at least at the stage that we were doing the research in. And if there was community engagement to take place, then it was done against a background of, well, we want to avoid triggering any local resistance. So let's minimize impacts on landscape, minimize impacts on the community as far as possible. And when we spoke to residents in these 3 different communities, we found a lot in common in how they were talking about the places that they lived in and the industries that they had grown used to living beside, sometimes over many generations. There was a strong sense of pride in industry, a strong connection to industry, but an awful lot of ambivalence as well, due to the clear negative local and global impacts of those polluting, carbon-emitting industrial sources. And there was also a strong emphasis upon the idea of balance. And people in each of the 3 communities we spoke to talked about an unbalanced relationship between the community and other stakeholders, principally industry, but also government as well. And there was a kind of nostalgia for the 1970s and the 1980s when there might have been an anchor employer, but was seen as being much more closely and deeply embedded in local communities in terms of enabling social and cultural activities, and a sense of retreat, a sense of imbalance as a result of taking from the economy but not giving to the same degree in recent decades. And that led to some pretty depressing depictions of what these places are really like, even by the people who feel very strongly at home and a sense of belonging with these places. Places being neglected, dirty, dying downhill. That's what these people are saying their own communities are like, even if they feel very proud to live in those places. There's also a broader context in the sense of there's a lot of talk about billions of pounds and lots of numbers and investments, and these people are aware at the same time of food banks, child poverty, the closure of health services, etc., in these local areas. And that makes a challenging backdrop to the kind of boosterist narratives that I mentioned previously. There was very little awareness, we found, of the broader cluster plans, which I think is a legacy of the kind of engagement that was being practiced at the time. But most people were really keen to know more and were interested to know what was going on, but were very skeptical about anything they perceived as being simply PR. They want to see the good and the bad and the uncertainty and the ugly. They don't just want to be seeing positive press releases and marketing or place branding. They were also fearful of the sense that decarbonisation essentially was going to be pushed onto them. It wouldn't be something that they would be done with, but done to. And their experiences really channeled how they perceived industrial decarbonisation. Those that had worked in industry already tended to have much more positive perceptions of what the future might hold in comparison to others who had been less directly involved. They acknowledged and were willing to support the idea of rapid decarbonisation, but they had a whole raft of concerns and questions about the feasibility of technologies, and particularly around the use of hydrogen from non-fossil fuel or from fossil fuel sources. So you can see various quotes there on the right-hand side from Ellesmere Port, in that case, about the kind of engagement that has not or could be taking place, and people's concerns about what might happen, but a sense that they might become proud of this place if it became a world-leading location. So it's not that these people are anti-industry in any shape or form at all. So what we decided to do then, given that disparity between those different perspectives, was to create a framework. And in fact, we created 2 frameworks, and I'm going to show you those briefly now before I finish. The first one is about this place-sensitive approach that I mentioned. And it's a framework which is designed to enable guiding principles or actionable knowledge for stakeholders who are involved in deploying technologies of this kind. It is not a public engagement plan or a simple tool to instrumentally deliver a social license. In practice, that's virtually impossible. There will always be trade-offs and tensions and contestations in the deployment of a large-scale energy infrastructure. But what you can do by referencing some of these principles is at least engage with that broader context in which large-scale technology is going to be deployed, and you increase the possibility of something that is a mutual kind of win-win situation for everybody living in the area and working in the area and impacted by it. So I'm going to briefly take you through those 6 place dimensions in the middle of the framework there. We've already mentioned pride in place and the fact that both stakeholders and communities wanted to imagine industrial decarbonisation as something that would make people and workers and visitors feel proud of those areas. So that baseline is there to some degree, but it requires shifting the focus, I think, beyond simply looking at skills or training of people to thinking about building trust and reciprocity between actors. For example, what we found was that members of the community were prepared to come to focus groups run by the university, but they were much less willing to engage with initiatives run by the local authority because they had been to too many consultations before and seen absolutely nothing change as a result. So there was a sense of concern there about whether it had any impact at all. And regaining that trust once it's gone is very difficult to do because people expect a repeat of what they've already learned. So one of the ways I think there is an opportunity here, and we're starting to see it in some places like Grangemouth, is to envision in a co-produced way, in a kind of a collaborative way with multiple actors, what these net zero targets might look like and what deployment of specific technologies in these places is going to do in terms of making these better places to live, more prosperous in wider senses. Some of that is about recognizing the capacities and knowledges and experiences of local people and bringing them into the technology deployment process rather than regarding people as passive recipients of knowledge or technologies being deployed. So there's a raft of ideas there which I think could be employed positively, recognizing the changes that have taken place, the kind of historical dimension that people see CCUS in the light of waves of industrialization and deindustrialization over time, over decades in these places. It's not the first thing that's ever happened in these communities. So they see that backdrop and they're asking, is it going to be more of the same or is it going to be something different? And that's what needs to come across, I think, in terms of plans. So briefly, just to touch on this final piece of work that was done through the IDRIC project, which was taking those ideas about place and integrating them with other projects done by these other universities to do with social license and just transition. And it involved 9 researchers from these 4 universities and a range of non-academic partners, some based in Scotland. And it again tried to produce a kind of a framework which could be useful beyond the lifetime of the IDRIC consortium and the research projects themselves, something that might be useful for stakeholders, not just producing academic journal papers. So if you want to take a look at this figure, you've got to look at it from the inside and work out. So at the center, you've got this idea of an ongoing process. So this is kind of bringing in the idea that any technology like CCUS, once it becomes deployed, is part of an evolving dynamic process of change in place over time. This is why you have to think about the locations of technology deployment as evolving places that have histories and memories and experiences that inevitably are folded into what you're trying to do in the real time in the present. There are 3 ideas of justice coming out of social science writings, of environmental justice in particular. So we have recognition justice, which is about understanding the context of the place, local knowledges and histories and capacities, and bringing them in where appropriate into development processes. You've got the distributive side, which I think is often a focus in these discussions about making sure that some of the benefits at least go to local people, some of the jobs, some of the prospects, a fair distribution of not just the costs, which they're used to living with in terms of the smells, the dangers, the hazards, etc., but also some of the benefits as well, against the uncertainty of competition and decline that I mentioned. And then finally, a procedural sense of being engaged with, not being talked down to, having the ability to have adult conversations about the potential downsides as well as the upsides of these technologies being deployed. So a hunger for knowledge, but also willing to be listened to and appreciated at the very same time. And then finally, seeing all of these things as happening within these wider contexts of connecting up government, which of course doesn't tend to happen that often. Government tends to work in silos or in a fairly piecemeal or quite complicated manner between different institutions and between levels across the UK. It's an incredibly complicated picture, as we all know. There are inevitable trade-offs and tensions, but also a sense of needing to rebuild trust and legitimacy in order to move forward in a way that is reflective of those ideals of a just transition. So just to finish, in terms of recommendations for industrial decarbonisation, it's not replacing a perspective with something else, it's adding a perspective. Add a place-sensitive lens to your toolbox. It's viewing technology deployment like CCUS and cluster building as an ongoing process of placemaking and an opportunity to create better places and communities by 2045, 2050, etc. But to do this properly, you have to treat host communities as key stakeholders in themselves, not leave them to the very end until you decide to say anything to them. Rebuild reciprocal relationships that are out of balance at the moment, engage transparently and accessibly, take community concerns seriously and address them, detail exactly what kind of local benefits there will be, and consider the broader place dimensions of any technology deployment in the context of people's concerns about food banks, declining health services, poverty, lack of transport, lack of housing. What do people do? What do young people do? Educational programs, etc. And if this might seem a big ask for multinational companies who have maybe very little potential loyalty to specific industrial heartlands or declining places, then surely there's a very strong role for government and policy here to interconnect governance at different levels, to lead potentially these visioning processes in local places, to represent local concerns with to industry and needs, to uphold regulations, because that's not assumed to be a done deal at all, and to ensure accountability and manage trade-offs. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there. And for more information,
So we've got about 15 minutes or so now for questions. We've got a roving mic. Rose has got a roving mic. If anyone would like to ask a question, please introduce your name and where you work, what your interest is. Please, any questions from the floor?
Thanks. So I'm Neil McFadden. I'm from the Northwest Cluster. So we're track 1 for carbon capture, and we're also one of the 4 regions chosen for, actually in common with the other 2 that you did in your research on sense of place. We're track 1 for green skills. So we've got £1 million to spend on green skills. My question is, we're going to have a mayor responsible for Cheshire and Warrington from May 2026, and they'll be responsible for economic growth and skills. So what do you think the mayor should do to make sure that all these jobs go to local people and they start feeling proud to live in Ellesmere Port and Chester and the other cities that are going to be affected?
What do I think the mayor can do? Well, I mean, I think it's a positive development. When we spoke to clusters in the Northwest cluster, there was a sense to some degree in Cheshire that the cluster was seen by some as predominantly a kind of a Liverpool to Manchester axis, and the Cheshire side needed a bit more emphasis. Of course, intriguingly, North Wales didn't seem to be emphasised really at all. So I think it's positive in that sense. Clusters are always going to be some kind of loose network of different government agencies and institutions and territories. And Northwest is really interesting the way it spans England and Wales and across those different parts of the region. So I think having a balanced leadership is important, I think. And so that mayoral appointment may well ultimately be very important. It's hard to say at this outset, but as I said, there were sensitivities already there around the naming of that cluster. What should it be called? And it hasn't always been called the Northwest Cluster. It's often referred to in other ways. And people felt slightly concerned about the way in which that broader canvas wasn't being represented in its sense of place. So if it rebalances that, then yeah, I would say it's good.
I mean, I think, oh, sorry, I don't even know if that's on, but I mean, I think the main thing is obviously we're working much more at the kind of macro level and in terms of, you know, policies maybe a little bit more nebulous, but I think, you know, one of the big concerns, and I think, I mean, I don't conduct your type of work, but from what you hear people kind of being concerned about and things like that, is that, you know, you could resolve a lot of these labour market challenges by bringing workers in rather than the jobs going to local people. So in that way, you would be able to bring down costs, maximise benefits at the UK level. You might not be maximising them at that regional level. So I think then there's, and we did do some work, Christian led, that where we looked at regional level, you know, kind of like where might the jobs go and where might they be located? And I think, you know, where you have that place-based challenge and local concerns, it's where are those workers coming from? Or are you, because often when you bring in migrant workers, they might not perhaps engage very much with the local economy. They might work long shifts and things like that. And so they don't even actually come and bring additional spending in. So you can end up, your impact at the UK level can be positive and, you know, net positive, but it might not be at the place level.
I think coming back to the mayor issue, the only thing I'd add is that what kind of leadership is going to be evidenced by this new figure? We see increasing kind of authoritative leaders in the world, but I think a lot of what people on the ground are saying is we're not listened to. So it kind of depends how that unfolds and how much engagement with leaders at the local authority level and at the community level are actually part of that process of acting like a mayor happens next. And of course, Karen is absolutely right that the figures on displacement of jobs, there's also a story in there about community and about place, and it's not to be ignored because that's also important. It's not the only thing, but it's part of the story.
Yeah. I think the local people will be very upset about net zero if it just relies on a load of immigrants coming, rather than them seeing the economic benefit of the job. So that's why I think it's a big concern. It may look good from the macroeconomic level, but for the local people, they'll say, why is this happening to us? Who are all these people?
Yeah, but I think it's already happened. It's already started happening. It's new. If you walk down Ellesmere Port High Street and you see the banks are closed, etc., bars are shut up. So it's nothing new in a sense. Skilled employees who choose to live elsewhere in Cheshire and commute in, as you said, very little local benefit to the economy in that sense. So that has to be tackled, I think, as part of the process of change.
I think if I can add a tack-on question to that, you know, thinking about the role of different leaders, and when you were talking about kind of co-producing a vision for these places, but the local authorities weren't necessarily trusted, the industry aren't trusted, who should lead that co-production process? The problem is, I'm sure we've experienced as well as academics, is that you can lead those processes, but you actually don't have any teeth to do anything about it yourselves as academics. So how do you see that unfolding?
I think it's disastrous to, you know, IDRIC was great, but it's over. You know, it's finished. Projects come to an end. It's great that we can go into communities and people are willing to listen to us and speak their views to us, but we can't substitute the role of a local authority or institution. You know, that's not what academics are able to do. So I think it's a big question, but I do like the attempts to initiate new kinds of structures in Scotland, like the Grangemouth Future Industry Board, which are inevitably going to be partnerships between public, private, civic sector organisations. That, I guess, is going to have to be the case. So it's good to see that being trialled as kind of innovations, and then where necessary, bring academics in for knowledge and expertise where you need it. But there does need to be the case. But it's difficult, as I said. Some people didn't want to come to our focus groups because they thought there wasn't any point, because it was all a done deal and wouldn't make any difference anyway. But others were only prepared to come to our focus groups. They said they just completely lost faith with the local council, weren't prepared to go to any of their events anymore. It's a difficult terrain to work in because of what's happened.
And I think for people like us that are estimating economy-wide impacts, is that how can we get that evidence to land? You know, can we get, you know, start to influence decision making in terms of, you know, the benefits that you can get, you know, be it at the macro level or be it at the local level. So, you know, there is a job for those of us who are estimating what kind of costs and benefits could be, or as how can, and part of it is partnering with industry and with government in terms of to make sure that you build consensus around some of the evidence that we're producing and it's valued.
It raises lots of issues around the trust and relationships between all the actors operating at the cluster level. I don't want to dominate this because this is like part of my area of interest of research as well. And a lot of what Patrick's been talking about very much resonates with a lot of different social science projects across the board. It's not, you know, talk to a small number of people and you find a small number of people's views. We're finding these results sort of, and this evidence repeating across the board in lots of different studies in lots of different places. Right, okay, back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Both very interesting. Adrian Topham, the Crown Estate. I work on the CCS side of the Crown Estate, but of course, place is a big part of our whole new strategy. But the point, not to do with my side of things, but the interesting point I was thinking is there must be cluster leadership still in all these clusters. Can they consume some of what you're both generating and maybe lead it forward? Or is that what the Access project is about from your point of view, Patrick? But from a global or from a UK economics point of view, Helen, it's probably different, but are they a possible avenue?
Yeah, I think they could be. I mean, I guess I just don't want to overemphasize what I think we can do. As Karen's presentation showed, the primary goal that academics do in research is to publish peer-reviewed journal papers. And that takes almost all of our efforts to just get that over the line. It takes a long time, unfortunately, but that's how peer review works. In IDRIC and with impact accelerator projects, we do have the opportunity to do work that is more action-oriented and stakeholder-facing. And we have tried through the industry partners and through IDRIC more generally to produce outputs that are a little bit less indigestible in terms of academic jargon than most of the stuff that we write in journal papers. So yes, we have shared them. To some extent, I think, yes, there's a lot of synergies in the sense that what Access is trying to do and what these frameworks try to do is to give people maybe a different lens or a different perspective or a different set of words or concepts than they might be normally used to articulating when they talk about a problem like how do we make carbon capture and storage a success, or how do we create a new sector? It's another way of thinking and working with those problems. And if you get that uptake of that, then it can enrich, I think, the process, and that's what we're trying to achieve. So yes, I think cluster leads can do that, and lots of universities are trying as far as they can to share that knowledge as best they can.
And I think also when there's the trying to, I mean, a lot of it will depend on what stage different actions are at. Yeah. But, you know, kind of understanding the value, the whole idea of building consensus around the action and this kind of narrative around the emergence of what could be new sectors, new activities, more sustainable sectors if they're decarbonised. And so I think, yeah, and that's why, you know, when we're doing these impact acceleration things, you try to engage across the board with industry associations, with government, you know, with people in the clusters, is can this help to start to build the story about what's going on and what people benefits?
Jen, I think had a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, was there another one? That's Jen first.
One of the benefits of not being on the panel is that I get to ask questions to the panelists. So yeah, I was quite interested to hear your perspectives on research fatigue, research engagement fatigue. And it's something I've been aware of from, you know, many years on different topics, but I'm thinking particularly here, if we've got a focus on 4 clusters, track 1, track 2, how, and you know, taking on board the fact that as researchers we can only discover things, we can't then necessarily implement things. Are you seeing any evidence of researcher engagement? I work in the Scottish Islands as well on water, not just CCS, and I'm aware of one of the islands that had 40 requests for involvement in a research project last summer alone, and that wasn't the Isle of Egg, it was a different one. And the same kind of goes, it's relevant to you as well, Karen, in terms of people like maybe the clusters, the information you're trying to get for your models. So I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
I think it's a really good question, and it's something that I guess over the last couple of years, I've tried to think about more and more. Academics can become very extractive. You know, we pop in, collect our data, publish our papers, and disappear into the sunset. And that's not a particularly ethical way of conducting academic work. In this particular work, we recompensed community residents for their time through giving them vouchers for grocery shopping or something like that. So we weren't assuming that there would be no benefit to them directly from giving up their time to work or to come to focus groups, etc. As I said, we got different reactions from people in terms of recruitment. Some people were really keen to speak to us. You almost got the sense that they had said these kinds of things already and had become quite proficient in communicating those positions. They were well-known members of the community. So, you know, you can treat that how you want, but they're almost kind of professional focus group participants, perhaps, in a sense. Maybe not that representative then, but as I said, there were other people who would not come because they didn't think there was any point, because all the decisions had already been taken, and so research was largely a waste of time. So yes, I think fatigue is a problem. I think one of the things that we can do, certainly as academic researchers, is to imagine our research as a much longer term process. Maybe something that goes over years and decades rather than a 2-year project or a 3-year project or a 3-month project where we get in and get out quickly and take what we need and develop longer term relationships with communities. Really, it's the only way to be able to do that properly. That requires a more structured investment in the research process, becoming a partner in those places, which is difficult, but at least it provides a less extractive and more just framework for doing research in that sense. That's one way around it. I'm very wary of discussion about publics, which presumes that lack of engagement is because they're too tired or they don't care. All we know is that they're not engaging. We don't really know why, but we're always very good at coming up with ideas. And it might just be that they think there's no point because the outcomes won't make any difference to their lives, or it might be that, you know, they've just been there too often already. So I think we're thinking that through carefully and avoiding any kind of quick and easy suppositions about why they're notionally fatigued. Most of the time I find people are really thirsty to be involved in any kind of engagement political process rather than the opposite. It's actually quite different from that.
Yeah, and we haven't really had a problem, I think, because in terms of the people who we're asking for information, they maybe couldn't give it to us before because the stage of the process that they're at. So we've not hit that point yet, but we're not going out and asking the same people. That's what Patrick is.
Yeah, I think we've maybe got time for just one more question.
So thank you for an excellent talk. I'm Alex Harrison from the University of Oxford. I just wanted to ask both of you, given the clusters that you've been discussing are all based around sites of existing industry that either at present or at some point must have been economically viable, do you think there's anything we can learn from how this industry came to be in those places in the first place, both in terms of developing labour supply and either engaging with, or in many cases, creating those communities 100+ years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think almost definitely, and I think a key thing here is that a lot of what you are looking to do through decarbonisation is to sustain the jobs. You know, so you're looking to it as a next stage in the history of these areas. So yes, I think absolutely, and I don't think there's probably not enough work on that. Looking back at you know, kind of, you know, what made the investment decisions, what made these firms come to these places in the first instance. So yeah, probably a bit of historical work would be very useful. But I think, you know, there is a core thing here, I think, around actually, while you've got new activities in terms of CO2 transport and storage, that you are looking at in terms of the capture industries, you're looking to keep and, you know, have a prosperous future. So it's almost like the next stage in the history, but it would probably be useful to look back on what the previous one was as well. Yeah.
Yeah, if you go to, have you been to Milford Haven? Yeah, because there's a lovely museum there, and it is staffed by a bunch of OAPs who are living locally and they don't get any money out of it. And it traces the history of industrialization and the arrival of incomers into Milford Haven over time. It begins with the Vikings and raping and pillaging of local areas, but it goes through waves, particularly the oil and gas boom in the 50s and 60s. Before that, it was ice, the manufacture and distribution of ice. It was fishing, Second World War. So if you take the time to go to that kind of part of a community, you realize that any conversation we might be having about CCUS is just another unfolding piece of the history of and the tapestry of a community's life. And so if we're thinking about developing these innovative, amazing technologies for carbon capture and storage, that's what a place-sensitive lens does. You then also think about it in terms of a settlement which has been there since 8500 or whatever, and has seen these ups and downs of emergent, amazing economic industrial shifts, all of which were presaged by hoopla and boosterism about what amazing changes it would bring to the local economy. And of course it did, but only for a short period. Fisheries declined, the ice industry declined in Milford Haven, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the broader tapestry, and it's worth clarifying those broader narratives of change in terms of what the technology might do to the area as well as the economy more generally. Sure.
Thank you. So we're at time now. I want to move into the kind of post-search and accepting time. So I think just one thing to add that the whole of the kind of different body of research is being developed into a set of frontiers report to policy recommendations, industry recommendations, which should be written in an accessible format. So beyond kind of journal papers that have come out, a huge number of journal papers coming out. So there are those kind of focus reports on kind of topic based, one on policy, there's one on the kind of social responses as well, and there's a whole host of other ones on technical matters as well. So look out for those, because those should be out imminently. I'm not sure where to go for those, but they're all comments have stopped on them now, so it should be pretty soon that those come out. So there are posters and a drinks reception back in the foyer, and then for those who are going to dinner later in the civic chambers, hope to see some of you there later. Thank you very much.